Hello and welcome to Tom Talk Shop. Today I'm going to give you my 2 cents worth on cross-cutting and getting the most out of your hand saws. So if you like this content, please like, comment, and subscribe. We sure appreciate it, and thank you. Okay, so I'm at my bench now, and first thing we've got to do is we've got to look at our problem. And our first problem is how perfect does your cut need to be? Does your cut need to be absolutely rock solid on the first cut? And typically the answer is no. I almost never try to make a cut perfect. Well, saw is inherently less accurate than chisels and other things. So I simply, with the exception of cutting dovetails, I don't try to make them accurate, or a few other joints. So my first thing I'm going to stress is we don't want to be perfect. We just want to get the job done so that we can quickly clean it up and get on to the next thing. So most of the time you aren't going to worry about being perfect, and you just really need to relax going into the job and just kind of embrace the fact that you're going to be doing it in 2 parts. You're going to, mark, or 3 parts actually, sorry. You're going to be marking and preparing your cut. You're going to make your cut, and then you're going to pare your cut. It seems like it takes longer, but in the end, you're going to get a much, much better fit. Okay, so we've got all the basic things that we're going to need to do an effective layout. And actually, this is probably overkill, but I'm going to just go through the basic tools I use. It depends on the size and other factors. My most basic thing I use is my tri-squares. I've got 2 different ones here. One that I've had for a long time, and I wanted a little bit bigger one, and I actually have several of these. Take out to the job. If you lose them, you're not hurt so bad. Just a speed square from Big Box. This is not a particularly big one, but it fits in my pocket. Well, the standard big ones work a little better, but this one's handy for me. Good old combination square. It's got 45 inside and out, 90 inside and out, and your 45 inside, which is useful. It's got a level too, but for our purposes, not important today. Some kind of a straight edge. I just use a piece of wood like this. This is one I use for all kinds of trying, and I just, every so often, I just run a plane down it, I re-straighten it. A marking knife, and these are actually what I mostly use because they fit in your pocket and got a clip, and when you're not using it, the blade can be put away so you're not ripping your hide with it. So let's get on to the next portion of this. My first step is I'm going to determine my measurement. In this case, I'm going to just cut this board back to 32 inches. So we've got a simple measurement here, and I'm just going to mark my cut line at 32 exactly. Once I've done that, I want to go ahead and scribe myself a square line at my cut line. And the easiest way to do this is one reason why I like this kind of a knife, is you can just get it in your marking spot, slide the square up to it, and then just start with it, make a very light cut across. So I don't try to make it deep, but just enough to catch the blade. Now I'm going to make a second mark about there. So that's maybe 1/8 past it, give or take. And I'm going to go ahead and slide my square line up to it. I'm going to make a second mark. And I make that mark pretty deep. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add an angle. Let's see if we can get this where the camera can see it good. I'm going to just cut it in at an angle. And then remove the chip out of there. Hard to do it so the camera can see it. And this gives my saw something to drop down into. Now, if you're cutting a wider board, sometimes it's easier to use a chisel to do that last step. Now, what I'm going to do is cut on this outer line, and then I will use a plane or a guillotine or a chisel to pare back to that line. Now, my next step I'm going to do is I'm going to mark a line on my face. Yeah, on my edge. And I didn't mention earlier, but this was actually my square edge, so you should always square off your squared edge. This one actually has it's not square on the other side. After I've done that, I'm going to do the exact same thing. I'm just going to remove a little bit of waste so the saw will chase that line just a little bit. Now, this is a caveat to this technique. If you're using a pull saw, instead of putting it on the back side, if you're using a Japanese style saw, you're going to want to put it on this side. I still occasionally use Japanese saws. So what you would do is you do the exact same thing, but you would cut it like this. And with a Japanese saw, I would actually, and I'm not going to do it because it'll make my saw inaccurate, but I would notch out a bigger mark right here to make your first cut so it drops right in there. So with that, we'll move on to the next step. Okay, now I've got the board down on my bench and I'm ready to start my cut. So the first thing I'm going to do, this is a push saw, is I'm going to just actually rake the saw backwards a little bit to make my grab a little bit better. So there you can see I've made myself just a little bit of a bite. Now I'm going to go ahead and make one, maybe two cuts, just carefully because I'm going slow. And I use my thumb as a little bit of a guide. And once I have that, then I want to get the blade pretty vertical. And I'm going to make a couple of cuts to establish this line right here, to keep that as square as possible. Now that I've established that point, I'm ready to start really sawing. So what I'm going to do is just rake my saw back at a pretty severe angle and then start sawing. I'm not used to doing this slow. And when you do it this way, you'll see that the saw stays in that line and it's following your line that you're making with the blade. So it's keeping it straight. Once you're to the end, then you can get more vertical and it will saw a little easier. And then you can just grab the end of that and cut it off and you have a nice clean cut so there's not as much to pare off. Okay, I'm going to square or pare this end off on my guillotine. You can do this with a plane or even with a chisel if you can't comfortably do it with a plane. A shooting board also works well. For small stuff like this is the way I do it. If you're doing something over 5-6 inches wide, I do it freehand in the vise. And Sukey will put a link up to our video I did on squaring a panel. It's all the same technique and math to do that. This is kind of some splintery wood and it's small, so I'm just going to do it this way just to show you the end product. So what I'm going to do here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in this case, but you do the same with a plane. You just take a little off, and then you take a little bit more off till you're right to that line. Now, if I was doing a piece of trim or something, I might even go back and do a final test and make this even a measure of hair proud. But that just takes it right down to the line, just like that. Okay, so a lot of people, when they're sawing with a handsaw, and it doesn't matter if you're using a pull or a push saw, it works the same way, you just have to reverse the direction, have a lot of trouble staying square front to back. So this being the front, this being the back, you have a hard time staying square to it. You're not ever going to get it just perfect anyway. This is why I like to pare. But what I'm going to do here is just show you how I do it, and I'm just making a quick cut. I'm not going to the trouble of scribing everything, but I'm making myself a line here. And what I'm going to do is show you how I'm going to start my cut. I already did this, but we're going to go into a little bit more detail. So I'll start my cut, make my first one there like that, and then I will make two cuts, just quick in, to align my cut so it's quite square front to back. Now, the other problem a lot of people have, especially in the cross cut, is the blade tends to wander this way in the cut. So what I'm going to do, and again, I'm repeating myself, but this is pretty important, is now that I've established my front to back square, I try to cut pretty steeply following the line. I'm not used to doing this slow. So I follow the line, whether it's scribed or not, and close to it, keeping my angle pretty steep, just like that. Now, if you're still having trouble doing it, it's very possible that your saw is too sharp on one side or too dull on one side, or it's set too high on one side versus the other side, and it's causing it to pull. But even with that, you should be able to keep it in the line, and then you can just cut right through like that. Now, another big problem that a lot of sawyers have, and I'm no different, is you're going to get a blade that binds, and I'm going to see if I can get the blade to bind. When you're cutting around a knot, like right here, the grain is doing all kinds of fun things, doing this and doing that, going this direction and so forth. And this is quite frequently, as you're cutting through, it's going to want to pinch behind you. This is very narrow, so it's going to be hard to put a wedge in there. If you're cutting it long ways and cutting down through here, you just stick a wedge in the end and keep going. But since we're cross-cutting, and we're going to cross-cut about right here, cut around this knot, this might be a place where you're going to get some binding. So I'm going to mark it like I've been doing and just make my mark. Make my mark here, and doing this with a pull saw, you would just do it on the opposite side, flip it over. And I'm going to bet, I'd be surprised if it doesn't, it'll bind about when I get to there, if not a little bit before. Now, whenever you're doing a cut like this, it's a good idea, and this is an old sock stuffed with the rest of the sock, soaked in WD-40. Just give it a wipe of that every so often. Keeps the blade clean, and it keeps the resin and things off. This is some pretty resonant wood, so it may want to bind. And another thing that can cause your blade to bind is if you don't have enough set. We did a video on sharpening and setting your saw blade, and Sukey will put a card up for that. That's a good review of a good way to do it without having a bunch of special saw tools, because I just set them with a punch. And with enough set, it shouldn't bind near as much. All right, let's see if I'm right and it's going to bind. Yeah, a little bit. It's getting a little sticky right there. But if you go slow and just kind of power through it, it will let you do it. Yeah, and it was binding right there. But since the blade was slick and it had a good set on it, I was able to get through it pretty easily. Now, if it had been a piece of maple, it might have been a little bit more trouble, but it's the same difference. You can still get through it. Okay, so now I've got another interesting set of problems. This is kind of more of a problem with bow saws, but it's a problem with everything. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is, I've got a wide panel here we're going to saw and cut the end off. I'm not going to go fully square it because I've made a whole video on doing this. So I've got a line here that I measured right there, and I'm going to scribe it across. And you can see this is my biggest square that I have in the shop. Well, I'm not getting anywhere near enough reach. So a couple of things can happen, and I'm actually going to do this. I'm going to take and make another indexing mark right there. But you can take your straight edge and you can combine it with your square, if I can do this, and you can stick them together. And again, we're not going for absolute screaming perfection here. We're just going to get it close, because after it's done, I will take and use my square and a straight edge to plane this off, which we're not going to get into in this video. So then what I've done is, after I've done that, I want to just go ahead and use my straight edge, and I want to mark it. Again, this is like an opening cut, because I'm actually going to square this into the panel, and then I will cut the other end of the panel to fit. But I'm going to go ahead and make myself a mark, scribe it, and now that I've got a mark to follow, I can just deepen it freehand, because the blade will follow right in it. And then I'm going to start my cut there. This wood's a little bit harder than that pine. This is a lot harder. And get this done across here. Take just a second. And that's more than enough for the
saw to follow. Again, when you're sawing, don't necessarily need to be going for absolute perfection on the first pass. Now this line isn't my final line, but in fact what this is going to be is I'm going to square this end off. I'm not going to cut it to a specific length. I'm just going to square it using my combination square as a tri-square. It's pretty close. And get this end square off of my previously straightened edge. And then I'll measure my other length to fit the case that this is going on. And then I will cut that one to length and square it off. So this one is not, first of all, cutting it to length is not that important, but the other end will be. But getting it as close as you can will save you a lot of labor. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to just go ahead and mark my other piece. So I've got my line for cutting. Now this is where you're going to get into some quandaries. So if you're using a bow saw like this one, this is a simple bow saw, you'll be able to cut to about here before you start banging into it. If that's all you have, you can turn around, cut back going the other direction, and meet in the middle, and you'll probably be a little bit off, and then you can plane that out. That works okay. If you have a panel saw, which I don't actually own any good ones, I have a junker around here somewhere that we use for cutting plywood, but I don't have it inside. If you're using a Japanese saw, same thing. You're going to want to scribe your line and just work from one side to the other, carefully working across. This saw actually wouldn't cut this. It would break the teeth right off of it. It's really only for very soft wood. Now, so how I'm going to handle it with using a bow saw, this is just if you're using a bow saw, otherwise you would use a panel saw or the other saw. I'm going to take my saw, and this is a turning saw, and I'm going to put a few degrees in it so that my handle will clear. And I'm going to turn this so you can see. And when I'm sawing, my handle should clear these longest pieces sticking out. You got to make sure you get these pretty straight to start with. And this takes a little bit of technique, but once you get used to it, it's not hard. So now this is pretty much basically going to be a cut like anything else. And if you're using just a panel saw, it would be the same thing. You want to start your cut, just like we've been doing. Square your cut up. And then start making cuts going through it, following the line. And I'm going to put my glasses on so I can see. Okay, so now I'm doing my best to follow my line. I'm not worrying about absolute perfection. Just cutting along. Now, every so often you want to stop, kind of check your square and square it up a little bit and continue on. Starts getting sticky, you can pull the saw out and oil it up. As you can see here, not getting it just perfect, but not bad. And you just keep walking along. This kind of a cut, you don't want to get in too big of a hurry. And sometimes if you kind of walk out of the line like I tried to do, you have to put a little bit of tension on the saw. You can steer it very small amounts. Not much though. And now we're getting up to the end. Keep it at a pretty steep angle till you're right out to the end. And then you can straighten it up and take it through like that so you don't have any blowout. It's not perfect. It's a little bit higher there than the rest of it, but once you take the plane to it, it'll square right up. Now, if you're cutting it to length, you do just like I did on the shorter ones. Leave yourself an 1/8 or even a 3/16 cut, way proud of it, and then plane down to the line and you'll have a perfect fit every time. Okay, so to start with, we need to talk a little bit about having the right saw profile for the job. Let me get these out of my way. So we're going to start with the simplest of the simple. So I have what used to be my daily driver crosscut till I made the turning saw. That's my daily driver now. And that's a crosscut blade on there, as you can see. And it's really for dry, seasoned woods. It cuts everything from pine through hard maple quite good. But if you're out in the woods and you're cutting limbs or you're cutting wood that's quite green, I have this saw. It's basically the exact same thing. It's just a much coarser, much more aggressive profile. There are also a number of other profiles, but this is the one that I made this saw from, and it works quite well. It can be a little bit grabby, but it's got a very aggressive tooth and a really wide set, so the wood can't close behind it. Now, we're going to go to my daily drivers that I keep on my bench. I have my rip saw. This is for cutting long ways, of course, ripping. And it does exactly what it says on the tin. It rips, and of course it turns in this case, but a panel saw to do the same thing. And my crosscut saw, which we've been using throughout the video. And again, the same basic blade as the other one. The only difference is it's a little bit longer this way for me, and I can turn it to get into tight spots. Okay, now we're going to get down into the accuracy versus speed thing. Now, these are my 3 saws I use for joining and cutting around things. So this is my turning saw, which is probably my most used joining saw, and it lives on my bench. And I cut dovetails with it and everything, and of course it can turn also. I think it's about 10 teeth per inch, something like that, maybe 10, 11. And it also can turn, it can cut around corners a little bit, and it makes a cut that's good enough to, it doesn't require a lot of cleanup, or if any, and it will rip a bit, though not much. Now, if I'm cutting really small joinery or really small dovetails or sometimes really hard wood, I get this old guy out. I don't use it much anymore because it's really a pain to sharpen. You have to use a Japanese file, and this cuts on the pole. And this is just an old pole saw I have, but it cuts much finer. It's about 20 odd teeth, missing a few too. And then when you want down to the finest, or you got to cut around corners, you drag out this miserable thing. Someday I'll get around to making a real frame for these blades, but this is just a coping saw. Now, when you need a really fine cut, or you've got to match a profile, this is the saw for the job. Okay, so now the last part of it I wanted to talk about just a little bit is ergonomics. And ergonomics starts with your bench and where you have everything. If you've got them in a chest over there across the room, well, that's a whole lot less ergonomic than if you're just working here and I need to make a cut. So what I have here is I have my most used saw, that one, within the easiest reach. My second most saw here, within slightly less easy. And then my much less used saws, but I still use them a lot, here. And that one is just kind of where I could fit it. And then all the saws I use a whole lot less, way over on the wall. And how I saw in this shop is I saw off this end of the bench, quite an awful lot actually. It's not the most comfortable for me, but if it's a small piece and I've got to hold it like this and hold it with my hand, particularly if it's a very small piece, then I can cut it like this. I can come over here and I can work off my bench. And I usually keep my bench right behind me because I sit on it a lot while I'm working too during the day, so I'm not standing all day. And then if I'm tired or whatever, I'm pretty ambidextrous, so I can saw either way. Quite often, depending on what it is or the angle, I can put the piece here for cross-cutting and I can saw off this end, which is why on my bench I put these big, I don't know what you call these. You don't usually see these on a bench, but I put them on there. I'm not sure it was a good idea, but I do use them quite a bit I like the overhang on the end there. So that's kind of how I handle that. Another thing when you're working is whether you want to saw something and you want to clamp. I almost never clamp anything when I'm cross-cutting unless it's something involving joinery. And then it either goes in the bench, in the vise, or I put it on this portion of my bench and I hit it with the hold downs
and then I'm like sawing something out of the center of it. But very frequently I'm clamping it right here. And then sometimes it's a creative matter of how you're going to hold it still. But if I'm doing that, I'm using a coping saw, or I'm using this saw right here, and I'm just getting it on the bench like so. But sometimes clamping is necessary, especially if you need to be really accurate or it's a fussy piece of wood. Now, probably the last thing I'm going to talk about in this video is just straight up ergonomics. I'm getting to the point in life where I have a bad shoulder, I've got a bad leg and a bad foot, so everything bothers me and a bad back. So you've got to think about heights. So like I'm here working, and I saw off, particularly right here a lot. You know, if I wasn't planing on this bench, I'd really like it to be 2 or 3 inches lower. This is actually, when you're making your squaring cut, it's a really uncomfortable cut. So if it's a really hard piece of wood, I move over here, which is why I keep one of the benches behind me all the time, so I can grab it right here and work. Again, if you can work off your bench and you like doing that, that's fine. But for heavy cutting, I almost always try to get something down low. If you're using a panel saw, you might want to have a bench that's split down the middle. It'll make your life easier, but with these, it just doesn't really bide you anything. So that's why we use the solid top ones, both of them. And the other one's got dogs in it too for holding stuff, which really is handy, especially for ripping. And so that's kind of where that's at. I don't really have any other big suggestions in the arena of cross-cutting. Once we get into ripping and resawing, I have a lot more things to say. But I think that will cover most of it.